Hello, my friend. I'm so glad you're here. How was your day today? I hope it treated you kindly, but if it was a bit heavy, don't worry. You're in a safe space now. Take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and let's settle in together. Tonight, we're going to drift gently through stories from the past, letting the calm wash over you, like waves softly lapping against the shore. Just you, me, and the whispers of history, guiding us quietly toward rest. Chapter 1. The Drowsy Valley, a place where time stands still. In the gentle bosom of one of those spacious coves that indent the eastern shore of the Hudson River, there lies a region blessed with an almost supernatural tranquility. The ancient Dutch navigators who first sailed these waters knew this wide expanse of river as a Tappan Zee, and they would always, with cautious reverence, shorten their sails when crossing these waters, invoking the protection of good St. Nicholas as they went. Let your breathing slow now as we approach this peaceful shore. Here, cradled between rolling hills and the whispering river, sits a small market town that some call Greensburg, but which is known far and wide by the more melodious name of Tarry Town. Imagine it now, a collection of Dutch-style houses with their characteristic step gables, their windows glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. The name Tarry Town itself speaks of lingering, of taking one's time, of the pleasant art of dawdling. Legend tells us that the good housewives of the countryside gave it this name in gentle mockery of their husbands, who would find endless reasons to tarry about the village tavern on market days, prolonging their errands far into the evening hours. Can you picture them? Stout Dutch burghers in their broad-brimmed hats, laughing over their pipes and ale, in no particular hurry to return home to their duties. But whether this tale of the town's naming is true or merely pleasant folklore, I cannot say with certainty. What I can tell you, with absolute conviction, is that not far from this village, perhaps 2 miles distant, perhaps a bit more, there nestles a little valley that seems to exist in a different realm entirely from the rest of the world. This valley is special beyond measure. It is a lap of land cradled among high hills, hills that rise like protective walls around this secret place. Here, the outside world and all its clamor and concern cannot penetrate. A small brook, gentle as a lullaby, glides through this valley with just enough murmur to lull any visitor into immediate repose. The water speaks in soft syllables, telling ancient stories in a language older than words. Listen, can you hear it? The gentle whisper of water over smooth stones, flowing, always flowing, never rushing, never urgent, just flowing in its own peaceful time. The occasional whistle of a quail breaks the silence like a blessing. The tap-tap-tapping of a woodpecker against bark creates a rhythm as old as the forests themselves. These are almost the only sounds that ever disturb the uniform tranquility of this enchanted place. Even these sounds don't break the peace. They enhance it, like punctuation marks in a long, drowsy poem. The narrator of our tale, a gentleman named Diedrich Knickerbocker, whose papers contained this very story, recalls visiting this valley as a young man, a stripling boy with a new rifle and dreams of adventure. He wandered into a grove of tall walnut trees that shaded one side of the valley. It was noontime, that magical hour when the sun stands still in the sky and all of nature seems to pause and hold its breath. Picture this moment with me. The dappled sunlight filtering through the walnut leaves, the heat of midday pressing down like a warm blanket, the absolute stillness of that moment. When young Knickerbocker fired his rifle at a squirrel, the sound startled him terribly. The roar of the gun shattered what felt like Sabbath stillness, and the echo rolled around the hills, reverberated through the valley, seeming almost angry at having been disturbed from its long meditation. Even then, as a boy, Knickerbocker understood that he had found something precious. He thought to himself that if ever he should wish for a retreat from the world and all its distractions, a place where he might steal away and dream quietly through the remainder of a troubled life, he could imagine no more promising sanctuary than this little valley. And what was this valley called? What name did the local folk give to this place of perpetual peace? They called it Sleepy Hollow. Let those words settle over you now like a soft blanket. Sleepy Hollow. Feel how the very name seems to encourage rest. Sleepy Hollow. A place where drowsiness is not fought against but welcomed, embraced, celebrated. From the listless repose of place, and from the peculiar character of its inhabitants, descendants of the original Dutch settlers who had brought their old world ways and old world magic to these new world shores, this sequestered glen had long been known by this perfect, this most appropriate name, Sleepy Hollow. The rustic lads who lived there were called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all the neighboring countryside, and there was something about these young men that set them apart. They moved more slowly than other youths. They spoke more softly. Their eyes held a distant, dreamy quality, as if they were always half looking at something no one else could see. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land of Sleepy Hollow, and to pervade the very atmosphere itself. It's as if the air is thicker there, more laden with invisible things, more conducive to visions and reveries and long, contemplative silences. Some say, and here our tale begins to take on its more mystical qualities, some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. This mysterious physician, whose name has been lost to time, allegedly performed certain rituals that permanently altered the spiritual atmosphere of the valley. Others claim that long before any European set foot in this place, an old Indian chief, a prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there. In these ceremonies, they say, he called upon ancient spirits and made pacts that would endure long after his people had been displaced from these lands. Whether either of these explanations holds any truth, we cannot know. What is certain, absolutely certain, is that the place continues under the sway of some witching power, some enchantment that holds a spell over the minds of the good people who dwell there. The residents of Sleepy Hollow walk in a continual reverie. Their footsteps are slower than those of ordinary mortals. Their thoughts drift like clouds across a summer sky. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, subject to trances and visions, and they frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air that others cannot perceive. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars seem to shoot across the sky more often here than anywhere else. Meteors glare with particular brilliance across the valley, and the nightmare, that spectral creature of disturbed sleep, with her whole ninefold retinue seems to make Sleepy Hollow the favorite scene of her nightly gambols. But there's one spirit, one dominant supernatural force, that haunts this enchanted region above all others. This entity seems to be commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air, the undisputed master of the valley's mysterious forces. It is the apparition of a figure on horseback, without a head. Let that image form slowly in your mind's eye. A rider, tall and imposing in the saddle, but where the head should be, there's only darkness, only absence, only mystery. According to the whispered tales told around firesides on winter nights, this is the ghost of a Hessian trooper, one of those German soldiers who fought for the British during the Revolutionary War. His head, the story goes, had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle, lost forever in the chaos and violence of war. Now, this headless rider is ever and anon seen by the country folk, hurrying along in the gloom of night as if on the wings of the wind itself. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend to the adjacent roads, and especially to the vicinity of a church at no great distance. The most authentic historians of those parts, those careful scholars who had devoted themselves to collecting and collating all the floating facts concerning the spectre, allege that the body of the trooper was buried in the churchyard. Each night, they say, the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his missing head. The rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow, like a midnight blast of wind, is explained thus. He is belated, and in a terrible hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. For reasons that no one fully understands, he must return to his grave before the first light of dawn touches the sky. Such is the general purport of this legendary superstition, which has furnished materials for many a wild story in that region of shadows. The spectre is known at all the country firesides by the name that children whisper to each other in delicious terror, the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. Now, here is something particularly remarkable about this place. The visionary propensity, this tendency toward dreams and visions, is not confined merely to the native inhabitants of the valley. No, it is unconsciously imbibed by everyone who resides there for any length of time. However wide-awake newcomers may have been before they entered that sleepy region, they are sure, in a little time, to inhale the witching influence of the air. They begin to grow imaginative. They start to dream dreams. They see apparitions. They find themselves believing in things they once would have dismissed as superstition. It is as if the valley itself breathes out some invisible vapor that alters the mind, that opens doors of perception usually kept firmly closed in more prosaic places. The narrator speaks of this peaceful spot with all possible praise, for it is in such little retired Dutch valleys, found here and there in bosom in the great state of New York, that population, manners, and customs remain fixed and unchanged, while the great torrent of migration and improvement that characterizes the new American nation sweeps by them unobserved. These valleys are like little nooks of still water that border a rapid stream. In these quiet eddies, you might see a straw or bubble riding quietly at anchor, or slowly revolving in its miniature harbor, completely undisturbed by the rush of the passing current just feet away. Though many years had elapsed since the narrator last trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, he questioned whether he would not still find the same trees and the same families vegetating peacefully in its sheltered bosom, unchanged by the passage of time. And it was in this byplace of nature, in this corner of the world where time moved differently than elsewhere, that there once abode, in a remote period of American history, some 30 years before this tale was told, a worthy individual of the name of Ichabod Crane. Let us pause here for a moment. Let your breath deepen. Let the name settle into your consciousness. Ichabod Crane, a name that sounds almost like a character from a dream. This Ichabod Crane had come to Sleepy Hollow to serve as a schoolmaster, to instruct the children of the vicinity in their letters and numbers. He was a native of Connecticut, that state which has always supplied the Union with pioneers for the mind as well as pioneers for the forest, sending forth yearly its legions of frontier woodmen and country schoolmasters. But we shall learn much more about this curious individual in our next chapter. For now, as we conclude this first section of our tale, simply hold in your mind the image of Sleepy Hollow itself, that drowsy valley where the brook murmurs its endless lullaby, where the hills stand guard like ancient sentinels, where the very air encourages dreams and visions, and where, on certain dark nights, the Headless Horseman rides in search of what he has lost. Let your eyes grow heavier now. Let your body sink more deeply into rest, as we prepare to meet the Chaebard Crane himself in the next chapter of our story. Chapter 2, The Schoolmace. A portrait of a Chaebard say. The night deepens around us. The stars wheel slowly in their ancient courses above Sleepy Hollow, and we turn our attention now to the peculiar figure who would become forever linked with this enchanted valley, the cognomen, that is to say, the surname, of Crane was not inapplicable to Chaebard's person. No, indeed, it suited him remarkably well. Picture him now, as the drowsy residents of Sleepy Hollow would have seen him on any given day. He was tall, exceedingly tall, but also exceedingly lank, as if his height had been achieved by stretching rather than by proper growth. His shoulders were narrow, giving him a perpetually hunched appearance. His arms and legs were extraordinarily long, almost comically so, and his hands dangled a full mile out of his sleeves, or so it seemed. His feet were enormous, big enough that they might have served as shovels had he wished to take up farming. His whole frame hung together most loosely, as if his various parts had been assembled hastily and without much care for how they fit together. His head was small, surprisingly small for such a tall man, and flat at the top, as if someone had pressed down on it during his infancy. From this small head protruded huge ears that stood out like the handles of a jug, and large green glassy eyes that seemed always to be staring with a mixture of curiosity and mild alarm. His nose was long and resembled nothing so much as the bill of a snipe, that nervous wading bird that probes in muddy banks. This nose sat upon his spindle neck in such a way that it looked like a weathercock perched on a church steeple, perpetually testing which way the wind might blow. To see him striding along the profile of a hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him like loose sails on a ship, one might easily have mistaken him for the genius of famine descending upon the earth, or perhaps a scarecrow that had escaped from its cornfield post and was now wandering the countryside in search of its original purpose. Despite his ungainly appearance, or perhaps because of it, there was something oddly endearing about Chaebard Crane. He took his position as schoolmaster with great seriousness, and in his own mind at least, he was a figure of considerable importance in the community. His schoolhouse was a low building of one large room, rudely constructed of logs. Let us step inside for a moment. The windows are partly glazed with actual glass, a luxury in those times, and partly patched with leaves of old copybooks, their pages covered with the laborious penmanship of previous students. The schoolhouse was most ingeniously secured during vacant hours. A a flexible twig, was twisted in the handle of the door, and stakes were set against the window shutters. This arrangement meant that while a thief might get in with perfect ease, he would find some considerable embarrassment in getting out. This idea had most probably been borrowed by the architect, one Jos van Houten, from the mystery of an eel pot, which operates on the same principle of easy entry but difficult exit. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation, just at the foot of a woody hill, with a brook running close by, the same brook whose murmuring we heard in our first chapter, and a formidable birch tree growing at one end of the building. This birch tree was of particular significance, for in those days the birch rod was a primary instrument of educational persuasion. From the schoolhouse, on a drowsy summer's day, the low murmur of pupils' voices conning over their lessons might be heard, like the hum of a beehive. This pleasant sound would be interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of the master, speaking in tones of menace or command, or by the appalling sound of the birch rod as he urged some tardy student along the flowery path of knowledge. Here, Ichabod Crane held forth as a monarch of his small domain. It is true that he administered justice with discrimination rather than severity, taking the burden off the backs of the weak and laying it on those of the strong. The smaller and more delicate students were spared, while the tough, wrong-headed Dutch urchins were encouraged to take their punishment like men. All this accords, he would say, with a maxim laid down by a wise schoolmaster. I would not have a man spare his rod and spoil his child. The students of Ichabod Crane could vouch for the fact that he was most conscientious in following this principle. When school hours were over, Ichabod did not sit idly by. No, he often became the companion and playmate of the larger boys. On holiday afternoons, he would convey some of the smaller children home, particularly those who happened to have pretty sisters or mothers noted for their good housekeeping and excellent cooking. You see, Ichabod's situation as a country schoolmaster was not particularly lucrative. He earned barely enough to keep himself alive, for though his head was said to be full of learning, his stomach was perpetually empty. The schoolmaster is generally a poor man in country communities, and Ichabod was no exception. To help make up his modest income, he followed the custom common in those parts. He boarded and lodged at the houses of the farmers whose children he instructed. He lived successively a week at a time with each family, moving his worldly possessions in a cotton handkerchief from house to house. This arrangement required him to be on his best behavior, and so Ichabod strove to make himself agreeable to his hosts. He was a helpful fellow, rendering himself useful in various ways to the simple farmers among whom he dwelt. He assisted with the lighter labors of the farm, helping to make hay, mend fences, water the horses, and drive the cows to pasture. He even had the extraordinary condescension to assist the good wife with their spinning wheels, sometimes sitting there through a long afternoon, his long fingers working the thread while he told ghost stories that made the farm children huddle closer together in delighted terror. In addition to his work as schoolmaster and occasional farmhand, Ichabod served as a singing master for the neighborhood. He made a handsome income by instructing the young folks in psalmody, the art of sacred singing. It was a sweet matter for him on a Sunday morning to take his place in the church gallery with a band of chosen singers, where he felt himself superior to the local parson. His voice would resound far above all the rest of the congregation, sending forth peculiar sounds that sometimes cause entirely new notes and strains to issue from his nose, sounds that may still be heard in churches to this day, and which are claimed by music scholars to have been legitimately descended from the nose of Ichabod Crane. In payment for his various services, Ichabod received not money but kind treatment and the necessities of life. He was regarded by the simple country folk as a gentleman of superior taste and accomplishments. He had read several books quite through, and was even said to be a master of that formidable volume, Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, a work that he firmly and potently believed, as indeed did all the residents of Sleepy Hollow. Now, we must pause here and consider the effect that this region had upon our schoolmaster's already active imagination. Remember what we learned in our first chapter. The valley has a peculiar influence on all who dwell there, opening their minds to visions and supernatural possibilities. For Ichabod, whose head was already stuffed with stories of ghosts and goblins from his reading, the atmosphere of Sleepy Hollow worked a particularly powerful magic. His appetite for the marvelous and his capacity for believing in it were both intensified by his time in this enchanted valley. He would spend long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives as they sat spinning by the fire, listening with delicious terror as they told him their tales of haunted spots, supernatural occurrences, and, most thrilling of all, the various sightings and encounters with the Headless Horseman. These stories sank deep into Ichabod's impressionable mind. He would then repay his host by telling them his own tales, drawn from his readings in Cotton Mather and other chroniclers of the supernatural. He spoke of witches, warlocks, mysterious signs, and prophetic dreams. He knew all about the alarming phenomena of New England, about the phantom ships that sailed on moonless nights, about the strange lights seen in graveyards, about banshees whose wails foretold death. Let your imagination drift now. Picture Ichabod sitting by the fire, his long face illuminated by the dancing flames, his green eyes wide as he recounts these tales in his reedy voice. The farm wives listening, their spinning wheels stilled, their children gathered close. Outside, the wind moans through the valley, the brook murmurs in the darkness, and perhaps, just perhaps, something moves in the shadows beyond the firelight. But we are getting ahead of our story. Let us return to Ichabod's daily life before we reach the fateful events that would change everything. Ichabod was a man of contradictions. Despite his outward appearance of being ethereal and insubstantial, a creature seemingly made more of cobwebs and flesh, he possessed a hearty appetite and a considerable capacity for physical labor when necessity demanded it. He could eat as much as a whole plowman, and he approached every meal with an enthusiasm that suggested he might never eat again. His taste for gossip was insatiable. He was considered by the country women to be a kind of idle, gentlemanlike personage, vastly superior to the rough country swains, and a great repository of local news. He would carry gossip from house to house with the dedication of a traveling news service, embellishing and elaborating on the stories as he went. The schoolmaster was also something of a matchmaker and a favorite among the young women of the district, who appreciated his learning and his sweet voice. At tea parties and social gatherings, he would gather little groups around him and tell them wonderful stories or warble songs while looking meaningfully at whichever young lady he hoped to impress. But there was one young lady in particular who had captured Ichabod's imagination and his heart, such as it was. Her name was Katrina Van Tassel, and she was the daughter of a substantial Dutch farmer named Bolters Van Tassel. Ah, Katrina. Let us picture her now as Ichabod saw her, a blooming lass of 18, plump as a partridge, ripe and rosy-cheeked, famous not only for her beauty but also for her expectations of inheriting her father's considerable wealth. She was withal a little of a coquette, as might be perceived in her dress, which was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions. She wore ornaments of pure yellow gold that her great-great-grandmother had brought over from Saddam in the old country, mixed with a more modern finery that she had acquired more recently. But it was not merely her beauty and her charming coquetry that attracted Ichabod Crane. No, what really captured his imagination was the thought of her father's farm and all its abundance. Old Bolters Van Tassel was a perfect picture of a thriving, contented farmer. He seldom sent either his eyes or his thoughts beyond the boundaries of his own farm, but within those boundaries everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. Let us visit this farm in our imagination, as Ichabod did in reality. The Van Tassel farmhouse was a spacious structure built in the old Dutch style, with gabled ends and a weathercock on top. The low projecting eave formed a piazza all around, where festoons of corn and peppers hung to dry in the sun. Below these, a beautifully varnished wagon stood under the shelter, alongside various farm implements always kept in perfect order. But it was when you approached the barn, the barn, that the true magnificence of the place became apparent. This barn was the pride of Bolters Van Tassel's heart, and rightly so. Every window and crevice of this magnificent structure seemed to burst forth with the treasures of the farm. The barn was filled with the bustle of busy life. Swallows and martins skimmed about the eaves, building their nests and raising their young. Rows of fat pigeons cooed contentedly on the roof, walking about with the air of housewives enjoying their own comfortable home. Sleek porkers grunted in their pens, awaiting the moment when they would be transformed into succulent bacon and savory ham. In the farmyard, regiments of turkeys gobbled in the sunshine, alongside guinea fowl whose harsh cries added to the general cacophony of farm life. Ducks and geese swam in a nearby pond, and broods of chicken presented a tempting display of poultry in every stage of maturity. And the fields surrounding the farm were abundant beyond imagining. Orchards bursting with fruit, meadows filled with fragrant clover and hunted flowers, fields of wheat and rye and buckwheat all growing in prosperous rows. When Ichabod Crane beheld all this abundance, when his imagination expanded as he surveyed these scenes of almost unimaginable prosperity, his heart yearned after the damsel who was to inherit it all. He pictured to himself every pot and pan, every pig and turkey, roasted and served and turned into delicious meals. He saw the fat ducks swimming in dishes of gravy, and the geese already roasted with onions stuck in their sides. He imagined the sides of bacon and the juicy smoked hams hanging in the cellar, ready to be carved and consumed. In his mind's eye, he could see himself already the lord of all this plenty, married to the fair Katrina, the envy of every man in the valley. He would sell the farm, take the money, and buy himself a place in some distant corner of the world, perhaps even venturing as far as Kentucky or Tennessee or, most daring of all, Michigan, those wild frontiers that represented the very edge of civilization. But we must understand that Ichabod was not the only suitor pursuing the lovely Katrina Van Tassel. There were others, many others, drawn by her beauty and her father's wealth like moth to a flame. Among these rivals, one stood head and shoulders above the rest in every sense. His name was Abraham Van Brunt, though he was known to all as Brum Bones, on account of his Herculean frame and great physical strength. Let us paint a picture of Brum Bones now, as a contrast to our lanky schoolmaster. Brum was broad-shouldered and muscular, with short curly black hair, a handsome if somewhat rough face, and a generally jovial though sometimes mischievous expression. He was famous for his feats of strength and skill in horsemanship. He was a hero of all the local races and cockfights, and wherever there was any athletic contest or boys' prank, Brom Bones could be found at the center of it. He was always ready for either a fight or a frolic, but he possessed more mischief than malice in his character. With all his roughness, there was a strong dash of good humor and generosity about him. When he led his gang of Rough Riders, a group of young men who looked up to him as their leader, through the countryside, the old dames would warn their children to stay indoors, for Brom Bones and his crew were known for their wild pranks and boisterous behavior. This formidable rival cast a dark shadow over Chabod's hopes. Any other man might have despaired of competing with such a physical specimen for the hand of Katrina Van Tassel, but Chabod had certain advantages that Brum lacked. He had a flexible, accommodating nature. He was subtle where Brum was direct. He was patient and persistent, qualities that sometimes matter more in courtship than physical strength and dashing good looks. And besides, Ichabod had unrestricted access to the Van Tassel home in a capacity as singing instructor to Katrina. And so the courtship continued. This unequal contest between the lanky schoolmaster and the robust horseman, both circling around the fair Katrina like planets around the sun, each hoping to be the one she would finally choose. As you lie here listening, let your breath continue its steady rhythm. In and out, slow and peaceful, just as the brook in Sleepy Hollow continues its eternal murmuring. As we prepare to enter the third chapter of our tale, where events begin to move toward their mysterious and fateful conclusion. But for now, rest a moment longer in this moment of anticipation. Feel the comfort of your bed, the softness of your pillow, and drift deeper into the peaceful state between waking and sleeping, where the best stories unfold. Chapter 3. The Gathering. An evening at the Van Tassel Farm. The autumn has come to Sleepy Hollow. The leaves on the trees are turning gold and crimson and amber. The air has taken on that special crispness that speaks of harvest time and approaching winter. And it is on one particular autumn day that our story takes a decisive turn. Ichabod Crane received an invitation that set his heart racing with excitement and anticipation. He was invited to a quilting frolic at the Van Tassel farmstead, an evening gathering where the young people of the neighborhood would come together for socializing, feasting, and merrymaking. Now, a quilting frolic was a significant event in these rural communities. It was an occasion where work and pleasure mingled, where the young women would gather to work on their quilts while the young men would hover nearby, ostensibly to help but really to flirt and court. As the evening fell, the work would give way entirely to celebration, with dancing and singing and abundant food. For Ichabod, this invitation represented a golden opportunity. An entire evening at the Van Tassel farm. An entire evening in the presence of the lovely Katrina. And better still, it would be an evening of festivity when the normal reserve of courtship might be temporarily relaxed. On the afternoon of the gathering, Ichabod dismissed his school earlier than usual. He spent at least an extra half hour at his toilet, that is to say, preparing his appearance, brushing and arranging his best and indeed only suit so that he might make as creditable an appearance as possible. For this special occasion, he borrowed a horse from Hans Van Ripper, the farmer with whom he was currently boarding. The horse was a worthy animal, deserving of some detailed description, for he would play his own role in the events to come. The creature was a broken-down plough horse that had outlived almost everything but his viciousness. He was gaunt and shaggy, with a ewe-neck That is, a neck that curved the wrong way, and a head like a hammer. His rusty mane and tail were tangled and knotted with burrs. One eye had lost its pupil and glared with a ghastly, spectral gleam, but the other eye had the gleam of genuine devil in it. Despite his decrepit appearance, the horse had more lurking deviltry in him than any young filly in the country. Hans Van Ripper himself, who was the best horseman in the region, preferred to ride this temperamental beast, and he called the animal by the somewhat ironic name of Gunpowder, in honor of his fiery temperament. Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups, which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of the saddle. His sharp elbows stuck out like a grasshopper's. His whole frame was loosely hung together, moving up and down with a horse's motion in such a way that you might have mistaken him for the ghost of a knight-errant in quest of adventures. As he jogged along the road toward the Van Tassel farm, Ichabod's mind was full of pleasant anticipations. It was one of those fine autumnal days when the sky is clear and serene, the air soft and comfortable, and nature displays all her rich bounty. The forests were dressed in their most brilliant hues of yellow, purple, and scarlet. The wild ducks were beginning their flight southward in long lines across the clear blue sky. Squirrels chattered and scampered through the branches, gathering their winter stores. The very earth seemed to exhale abundance and contentment. As Ichabod traveled, he passed through scenes that filled his heart with both delight and a kind of peaceful melancholy, that bittersweet feeling that comes in autumn, when the year begins to decline, but everything is ripe and full and beautiful. Let your mind wander now through this autumnal landscape with Ichabod. Feel the gentle autumn sun on your face. Breathe in the smell of falling leaves and ripening fruit. Hear the honking of geese flying overhead in their perfect V formation. Everything golden, everything peaceful, everything slowly, gently preparing for rest. But as Ichabod rode, his thoughts were not entirely on the beauty of nature. No, his mind was occupied with thoughts of the feast that awaited him. He had heard much about the hospitality of Baltus Van Tassel and the abundance of his table. Ichabod's imagination ran riot with visions of dainty dishes and delicious fare. He rolled his eyes as he imagined the ample charms of a Dutch country tea table. His mouth watered as he pictured the doughy doughnuts, the crisp and crumbling crullers, the sweet cakes and shortcakes, ginger cakes and honey cakes, all spread out in delicious profusion. He envisioned platters of plump poultry, dishes of sliced ham, preserves of peaches and pears and quinces, bowls of milk and cream, all intermingled with motherly teapots sending up their clouds of fragrant steam. As evening approached and Ichabod drew near to the Van Tassel farm, he could see other guests arriving from various directions. Young men on horseback, families in wagons, all converging on the center of hospitality and merrymaking. The house itself was thronged with the pride and flower of the adjacent countryside. Old farmers in their homespun coats and breeches, blue stockings, huge shoes, and magnificent pewter buckles. Their brisk, withered little dames wore close-crimped caps, long-waisted short gowns, and homespun petticoats with scissors and pincushions hanging from their belts. Buxom lasses, almost as old-fashioned in their dress as their mothers, only with a straw hat, a fine ribbon, or perhaps a white frock giving them the appearance of slightly more modern fashion. The sons, in square-skirted coats with rows of stupendous brass buttons, had their hair generally queued in the fashion of the times, especially if they could procure an eel skin for the purpose, for an eel's skin was said to be potent in making hair grow long and hang smoothly. Brom Bones, however, was a hero of the scene. He had come to the gathering on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature like himself, full of metal and mischief that no one but Brom could manage. Brom loved horses that had some spirit in them, animals that required a skilled hand and a firm seat. Ichabod, arriving on his borrowed, ill-tempered gunpowder, could not help but feel a pang of inadequacy when he saw his rival astride the magnificent Daredevil. But he pushed these thoughts aside and focused on the evening ahead. The feast lived up to all of Ichabod's most extravagant expectations. Indeed, it exceeded them. The table fairly groaned under the weight of the good things spread upon it. There was abundance beyond even Ichabod's most optimistic imaginings. Let us linger over this feast for a moment, as Ichabod himself would have wished to linger. Picture the long table, lit by candles in the flickering firelight, loaded with more food than seems possible. There were great dishes of Indian corn, smoking hot and covered with cream and butter. There were platters of cakes of various kinds, made according to recipes handed down through generations of Dutch housewives. There were stewed pumpkins, dishes of preserved plums and peaches and pears, broiled shad and roasted chickens, and delectable dishes of fried chicken and smothered chicken. And the pies. Oh, the pies. Apple pies and peach pies and pumpkin pies, all with crusts so flaky they seemed to melt upon the tongue. There were plates of delicate cookies and crullers, twisted into fantastic shapes and fried to golden perfection. Bowls of milk and cream stood ready, and mugs of sweet cider sparkled with their amber glow. Coffee sent up its rich aroma, and tea steeped in grand old teapots that had been brought across the ocean from Holland generations before. Ichabod Crane was in his element. He helped himself to every dish, rolling his eyes with delight at each new taste, his long limbs folded awkwardly under the table, but his appetite undiminished. He ate with the dedication and enthusiasm of a man who knows that such feasts are rare in the life of a country schoolmaster. Katrina Van Tassel moved among the guests, the belle of the ball, her cheeks flushed with pleasure at being the center of so much attention. She wore her finest dress, and her hair was arranged just so, and she smiled at all the young men with perfect democratic grace, favoring neither Ichabod nor Brom Bones with any special attention that might give away her true feelings. After the feast came music and dancing. The floor was cleared, and the furniture was pushed back against the walls. Someone produced a fiddle, and soon the lively sounds of an old Dutch dance tune filled the air. The young people formed sets for the dancers, their feet keeping time to the music, their faces bright with exertion and pleasure. The older folk sat along the walls, clapping their hands and tapping their feet, occasionally calling out encouragement or instruction to the dancers. Ichabod prided himself on his dancing. He was particularly proud of his ability to make up in agility what he might lack in grace. His long limbs flew about the room, his coat-tails flapping behind him like the wings of some large and awkward bird. He capered and pranced with great self-satisfaction, convinced that his skill as a dancer would impress the watching Katrina. Brom Bones watched all this from the sidelines with a mixture of amusement and annoyance. He was a skilled dancer himself, but his style was more forceful and less gymnastic than Ichabod's. He could see that the schoolmaster was making an impression, and this did not please him at all. As the evening wore on and the dancing continued, Ichabod managed to secure Katrina as his partner for several dances. He whispered compliments in her ear, and she laughed at his pleasantries, and for a moment the schoolmaster allowed himself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, his suit might be successful. But then came the moment when the older guests, seated around the fireplace, began to tell stories. And what stories they told! Tales of ghosts and goblins, of supernatural occurrences and inexplicable events. These were the kind of stories that the Dutch settlers loved, tales that had been passed down from generation to generation, growing more elaborate and mysterious with each retelling. Let us settle in and listen to these stories as the guest did, feeling the warmth of the fire on our faces, hearing the wind outside beginning to rise, making the old farmhouse creak and groan. They spoke of funeral trains and mourning cries heard near the church. They told of a woman in white who haunted the dark glen at Raven Rock, and was often heard shrieking on winter nights before a storm. They recounted the tale of Major Andre, the British spy who had been captured during the Revolutionary War in the neighborhood, and how his ghost was said to walk near the place of his capture. But the chief tale, the story that dominated all others, was of course the legend of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. Several of the guests claimed to have seen him on recent nights. They described how he would come thundering along the road, his headless form clearly visible in the moonlight, his ghostly horse breathing fire from its nostrils. One old farmer told of how he had been pursued by the Headless Horseman and had only escaped by crossing the church bridge, beyond which the ghost could not follow. Another told of hearing the thundering hoofbeats approaching from behind, faster and faster, until at the last moment the ghostly rider had veered off into the forest, leaving nothing but the echo of hooves and the smell of sulphur in the air. Brom Bones, not to be outdone, told his own tale. He claimed to have encountered the Headless Horseman one night while returning home on his horse Daredevil. The ghost had challenged him to a race, and Brom had accepted. They had raced at breakneck speed along the road, neck and neck, the Headless Spectre keeping perfect pace with Brom's magnificent horse. As they approached the church bridge, that boundary which the ghost supposedly could not cross, Brom claimed that he would have won the race handily, but just as they reached the bridge, the Headless Horseman had vanished in a flash of fire and brimstone. The guests listened to these stories with a mixture of terror and delight. The women pressed close together, and even the men shifted uneasily in their seats. Outside, the wind had picked up, and they could hear the branches of trees scraping against the windows like skeletal fingers seeking entry. Ichabod Crane listened to all these tales with rapt attention, his large green eyes growing wider with each new account. His mind, already full of ghostly lore from his readings, absorbed these new stories eagerly, filing them away alongside all the other supernatural knowledge he had accumulated. But while he was fascinated by these tales, they also filled him with a certain dread. For when the party finally ended and the guests began to depart, Ichabod would have to ride home alone through the dark countryside, through the very regions where these ghosts were said to walk. The party began to break up. Families gathered their children and made their way to their wagons. Young men mounted their horses. The house gradually emptied, and still Ichabod lingered, hoping for a few private words with Katrina. At last, he found his opportunity. The other guests had gone, and even old Bolters Van Tassel had retired to his bed. Ichabod and Katrina were alone, or relatively alone, with only a few servants moving quietly about, clearing away the remains of the feast. What passed between them in that conversation, we cannot know with certainty. The narrator of our tale tells us only that Ichabod emerged from the house shortly afterward with a very crestfallen and chapfallen air. Something had gone wrong. Something had been said, or perhaps not said, that had crushed all of Ichabod's hopes. The lovely Katrina had given him her answer, and it was clearly not the answer he had hoped to hear. With heavy heart and troubled mind, Ichabod made his way to the barn where Gunpowder had been stabled. He saddled the ill-tempered horse with hands that shook slightly, whether from disappointment or from the ghost stories he had heard or from both, we cannot say. And then, without saying farewell to anyone, without one last look back at the Van Tassel farmhouse where his dreams had been shattered, Ichabod Crane mounted Gunpowder and began the lonely ride home through the darkness of Sleepy Hollow. The night was heavy around him. The hour was late, that witching time of night when ghosts are said to walk and supernatural powers are at their strongest. The road ahead was dark, winding through forests and past haunted spots that had been so vividly described in the evening's ghost stories. As you lie here now, in your own safe place, let your breathing match the slow clip-clop of Gunpowder's hooves. In and out, steady and rhythmic, as we prepare to follow Ichabod on his fateful journey home. Chapter 4. The Midnight Ride. Through the darkness of Sleepy Hollow. The hour was late. The night was dark. And Ichabod Crane rode alone through the mysterious countryside of Sleepy Hollow, his mind heavy with disappointment and fear. Let us observe him as he begins his journey. See how he sits stiffly in the saddle, his long legs dangling, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. The high spirits that had animated him earlier in the evening have entirely evaporated. His dreams of marrying Katrina and becoming lord of the Van Tassel farm have been crushed, and now he must make his way home through darkness and danger. The night was dark, though not utterly black. The stars were hidden behind clouds, but occasionally a gap in the clouds would allow the moon to shine through, casting a pale, ghostly light over the landscape. These moments of illumination were almost worse than the darkness, for they revealed the twisted shapes of trees, the movement of shadows, the mysterious depths of the forest on either side of the road. All the stories that Ichabod had heard during the evening now came back to him with terrible vividness. His mind, so susceptible to supernatural fears, began to people the darkness with spirits and spectres. Every sound made him start. The cry of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the snap of a branch somewhere in the forest. The old horse, Gunpowder, seemed to sense his rider's nervousness and responded by becoming even more difficult to manage. The creature would sometimes come to a dead stop, requiring Ichabod to kick and prod him forward. At other times, Gunpowder would shy at shadows, nearly unseating his lanky rider. Ichabod began to whistle to keep up his spirits, but the whistle came out thin and tremulous, not at all the confident sound he had hoped for. He started to sing some of the psalm tunes he had taught to his students, but his voice quavered and broke, and somehow singing alone in the dark would seem to attract attention rather than ward it off, as if he were announcing his presence to whatever might be lurking in the shadows. Let your own breath match Ichabod's now, shallow and quick with nervousness. Feel how the darkness seems to press in, how every sound is amplified, how the imagination begins to run wild. As he rode on, Ichabod passed several of the places that had been mentioned in the evening's ghost stories. Here was the spot where Major Andre had been captured. Didn't those trees seem to lean in as if still mourning the doomed spy? There was a great tulip tree where a woman had been murdered, and which was therefore said to be haunted by her restless spirit. Wasn't that a flash of white among the branches, like the flutter of a ghostly dress? The road descended into a dark glen called Wiley Swamp, and as gunpowder splashed through the little brook that ran through it, Ichabod looked nervously about. This was said to be one of the places where the Headless Horseman sometimes appeared. But he made it through without incident, and his spirits began to lift slightly. Perhaps he would make it home safely after all. But then the road brought him to another place heavy with supernatural significance. He was approaching the famous church that marked the boundary of the Headless Horseman's domain. According to legend, the ghost could not cross the bridge that led to the church. If Ichabod could just make it across that bridge, he would be safe. The church stood on a small hill, about 200 yards from the road. It was a simple structure, built of weathered stone, with a peaked roof and a small bell tower. Around it lay the old burying ground, where the headstones stood like crooked teeth under the skeletal branches of ancient trees. The church bridge crossed a small stream, and on the other side, the road continued up a gentle slope toward the church itself. Moonlight, breaking through the clouds at just that moment, illuminated the scene with an eerie silver glow. It was a beautiful sight in daylight, peaceful and picturesque. But now, in the dead of night, with all the ghost stories fresh in his mind, Ichabod found it terrifying. The church seemed less like a place of sanctuary and more like a sentinel standing guard over secrets better left undisturbed. The gravestones cast long shadows, and the trees groaned in the wind like the voices of the dead. Gunpowder, that temperamental beast, chose this moment to become particularly difficult. The horse came to a sudden halt, planting his feet firmly and refusing to go forward. No amount of kicking or urging could convince him to proceed. Ichabod, his nervousness now approaching genuine fear, kicked harder. He slapped the reins against the horse's neck. He dug his heels into the animal's sides. "Come on, you confounded beast," he muttered, trying to keep his voice steady. Just then, something caught his attention. There, in the shadow of a large tulip tree on the side of the road, something moved. Or did it? Ichabod strained his eyes to see better. Yes, there was definitely something there. A massive, misshapen form, as dark and solid as the shadow it stood in, but somehow even darker, as if it absorbed all light that fell upon it. It was something gigantic, monstrous, towering up against the sky. For a moment, Ichabod's breath stopped entirely. His hair seemed to stand up on his head. His mouth went dry. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, looming and terrible. Perhaps it was just a tree? Yes, that must be it. Just an oddly shaped tree that his frightened imagination had transformed into something monstrous. Ichabod tried to convince himself of this, tried to force his racing heart to slow down. He summoned up all his courage and, in a voice that shook only slightly, called out, "Who are you?" There was no answer. The shape did not move. The only sound were the wind in the trees, the babbling of the brook, and Gunpowder's nervous snorting. Ichabod asked again, louder this time, with more authority, "Who are you?" Still no response. The thing, whatever it was, remained motionless and silent. Gunpowder, that contrary animal, suddenly decided to move forward, as if he too wanted to investigate this mysterious presence. As the horse stepped closer, Ichabod's eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he began to make out more details of the figure before him. It was mounted on horseback. That much was clear. A rider, sitting utterly still, apparently watching and waiting. As they drew closer still, the moonlight chose that moment to break through the clouds more fully, and Ichabod could see the figure more clearly. It was a rider of large dimensions, sitting on a powerful black horse. The rider wore a cloak or coat that fell in heavy folds, and where the head should be, there was nothing, just emptiness, just absence, just a smooth line of shoulders rising to nothing. The Headless Horseman. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Ichabod sat frozen in his saddle, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but stare in abject terror at the headless figure before him. Then, his survival instinct finally breaking through his paralysis, Ichabod kicked Gunpowder into motion. The old horse, seeming to sense his master's terror, needed no further encouragement. He sprang forward with more energy than he had shown in years, perhaps decades. Ichabod had meant to turn and flee back the way he had come, but Gunpowder, that contrary beast, had other ideas. The horse bolted straight ahead, toward the church bridge that represented safety. If only they could reach it. Behind them, Ichabod heard the other horse spring into motion as well. The Headless Horseman was giving chase. The thundering of hooves filled the night. Two horses racing through the darkness, one carrying a terrified schoolmaster whose long limbs flapped wildly as he clung to his saddle, the other carrying a headless spectre that seemed to embody every nightmare Ichabod had ever had. Let your heartbeat match Ichabod's now. Fast and pounding, racing. Feel the adrenaline, the pure animal fear of being pursued, the desperate hope of reaching safety. Ichabod dared to glance back over his shoulder. The Headless Horseman was keeping pace, his huge black horse matching Gunpowder stride for stride, and there, cradled in the horseman's arm where a head should have been carried if such a thing were possible, was indeed a round object, a head, perhaps, or something that served the same purpose. Faster! Ichabod cried to his horse, though Gunpowder needed no encouragement. Faster! They approached a rise in the road. Ichabod remembered that from the top of this rise, the church bridge would be visible. Just a little further. Just a little more. They crested the rise. Yes, there was a bridge, gleaming pale in the moonlight, perhaps 100 yards ahead. But the Headless Horseman was gaining. Ichabod could hear the powerful breathing of the black horse behind him, could almost feel the presence of that terrible rider drawing closer and closer. They raced down the slope toward the bridge. The wooden planks rattled beneath Gunpowder's hooves. They were on the bridge now, crossing it. Safe, all would be safe, if the legends were true, if the Headless Horseman truly could not cross this boundary. Ichabod urged Gunpowder up the opposite bank, feeling a moment of wild hope. Perhaps he had made it. Perhaps he was safe. But then he made the mistake of looking back one more time. The Headless Horseman had not stopped at the bridge. The ghost was crossing it, his huge horse's hooves making the bridge thunder and echo. And as Ichabod watched in horror beyond anything he had yet experienced, the Headless Horseman rose up in his stirrups and hurled the round object he had been carrying. It flew through the air like a dark meteor, growing larger and larger as it approached. Ichabod tried to dodge. He tried to duck. He tried to do anything to avoid that terrible projectile. But it was too late. The object struck him with tremendous force. Ichabod Crane tumbled from his saddle, falling with a terrible crash onto the hard-packed dirt of the road. And then darkness, absolute darkness, the kind of darkness that exists beyond dreams, beyond consciousness, beyond everything. Let that darkness wash over you now. Let yourself sink into it. Deep, peaceful, beyond thought, beyond fear, just floating in warm, comfortable darkness. Your breathing slow and steady, your body completely relaxed. As we move toward the final chapter of our tale. Chapter 5. The Morning After. The Mystery of Ichabod Crane. The night passes. The darkness slowly gives way to gray dawn, and the morning sun rises over Sleepy Hollow, illuminating a scene of mystery and speculation. The next morning, old Hans Van Ripper was troubled. His horse, Gunpowder, had returned home without his rider, the saddle hanging crooked, the reins trailing. The old farmer examined the animal with a worried frown. This wasn't right. This wasn't right at all. He waited for Ichabod to appear, thinking perhaps the schoolmaster had met with some minor mishap and would come walking up the road at any moment, embarrassed and full of explanations. But the morning wore on, and there was no sign of Ichabod Crane. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse as usual, expecting their master to arrive and begin the day's lessons. They gathered by the banks of the brook, tossing stones into the water, waiting. But the schoolhouse remained locked and empty. The morning sun climbed high in the sky, and still no schoolmaster appeared. Hans Van Ripper now began to feel genuine uneasiness about the fate of poor Ichabod in his saddle. An inquiry was set on foot. Several men from the neighborhood formed a search party and set out to look for the missing schoolmaster. They made diligent investigation, following the road that Ichabod would have taken from the Van Tassel farm. And after some searching, they came upon traces of the previous night's events. Let us follow them now as they make their discoveries. See how they walk along the road, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign. Hear how they call out to each other when something is found. In one part of the road leading to the church, they found the saddle trampled in the dirt. It had clearly been torn from the horse's back or had fallen off, and it lay there muddied and damaged. The men examined it carefully, noting the broken straps and the way the dirt had been disturbed around it. Continuing their search, they found deep tracks of horses' hoofs in the road, 2 sets of them running parallel, clearly at furious speed. The tracks led toward the bridge, the famous bridge where the Headless Horseman was said to halt his pursuit. The searchers followed these tracks to the bridge and beyond, and there, on the bank of a broad part of the brook where the water ran deep and black, they made their most significant discoveries. First, they found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod. It was his distinctive broad-brimmed hat, the one he wore when teaching school and singing hymns on Sunday. It lay on the bank, slightly crushed, as if it had been knocked from his head, and close beside the hat, very close, they found a shattered pumpkin. A pumpkin, smashed to pieces, its orange flesh splattered across the ground, its seeds scattered in the dirt. The searchers looked at each other with dawning comprehension. They examined the scene carefully. They noted the position of the hat and the pumpkin. They followed the tracks both forward and backward, and slowly, a picture began to form in their minds of what had happened here in the dark hours before dawn. The brook itself was thoroughly searched, for if Ichabod had fallen or been thrown into the water, his body might have sunk to the bottom. Men waded into the cold current, probing with sticks, looking for any sign of the schoolmaster. But the body of a Chabod crane was not to be discovered. Not in the brook, not on its banks, not anywhere in the vicinity. He had simply vanished. Hans van Ripper, as executor of Chabod's estate, such as it was, took possession of all the schoolmaster's worldly effects. It was a melancholy inventory. The sum total of a Chabod crane possession consisted of 2 shirts and a half, 2 stock for the neck, a pair or 2 of Worcester stockings, an old pair of corduroy small clothes, and a rusty razor. His personal library, such as it was, included a book of psalm tunes full of dog ears and coffee stains, a broken pitch pipe for teaching singing, and, most significantly, Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, a New England almanac, and a book of dreams and fortune-telling. In this last volume, the searchers found a sheet of foolscap paper much scribbled and blotted with numerous fruitless attempts to make a copy of verses in honor of the heiress of Van Tassel. These were clearly love poems that Chabod had been trying to perfect, crossing out and rewriting, struggling to find just the right words to express his feelings for Katrina. Hans van Ripper, a practical man with little patience for such nonsense, consigned these magic books and the poetic scroll to the flames forthwith, and from that time forward he determined to send his children no more to school, observing with some bitterness that he never knew any good come of this same reading and writing. As for whatever money the schoolmaster possessed, and he had received his quarter's pay but a day or 2 before, he must have had it about his person at the time of his disappearance. It was never found. Let your breathing slow now. Let the story settle around you like morning mist. Feel the peaceful rhythm of time passing in Sleepy Hollow. The mysterious event caused much speculation at the church on the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips were collected in the churchyard, at the bridge, and at the spot where the hat and pumpkin had been found. Everyone had their own theory about what had happened. The stories of old Brower, of Brombones, and a whole budget of other ghost sightings were called to mind and examined in light of this new event. When the assembled neighbors had diligently considered all the evidence and compared it with the symptoms of the present case, they shook their heads with grave solemnity and came to their conclusion. Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian. The Headless Horseman had claimed another victim. As Ichabod was a bachelor and in nobody's debt, nobody troubled their head any more about him after a decent interval of speculation and gossip. The school was removed to a different quarter of the hollow, and another pedagogue, one presumably less susceptible to supernatural fears, reigned in his stead. Life in Sleepy Hollow continued much as it had before. The brook murmured its eternal song. The trees grew and dropped their leaves and grew again. The seasons turned in their endless cycle. And gradually, Ichabod Crane became just another story told on dark winter nights, another ghost added to the rich collection of supernatural tales that haunted the valley. But wait, there's more to tell. It is true, an old farmer who had been down to New York on a visit several years after this event, and from whom this account of the ghostly adventure was received, brought home interesting intelligence that complicated the accepted narrative. He reported that Ichabod Crane was still alive. The schoolmaster had not been carried off by the Headless Horseman after all. According to this account, Ichabod had left the neighborhood partly through fear of the goblin and Hans van Ripper, and partly in mortification at having been suddenly and definitively dismissed by the heiress Katrina. He had changed his quarters to a distant part of the country, where presumably neither ghosts nor embarrassing romantic failures could follow him. There, the report said, he had kept school and studied law at the same time. He had been admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered for various causes and candidates, written for the newspapers, and finally had been made a justice of the 10-pound court, position of some minor authority and moderate respectability. So perhaps Ichabod had gotten what he wanted after all, or at least something close to it. Not the hand of Katrina Van Tassel and the prosperity of her father's farm, but respectability, position, and a place in the wider world beyond Sleepy Hollow. As for Brum Bones, who shortly after his rival's disappearance conducted the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, he was observed to look exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was related. He would always burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some to suspect that he knew more about the matter than he chose to tell. Perhaps, these suspicious neighbors whispered, it had not been the Headless Horseman at all that night. Perhaps it had been Brum Bones himself, dressed in a costume, riding his powerful horse Daredevil, carrying a hollowed-out pumpkin to serve as a head that he hurled at his rival. Perhaps the whole thing had been an elaborate prank designed to terrify the superstitious schoolmaster out of the neighborhood. But this was merely speculation. Brum Bones never confirmed or denied anything. He simply smiled his knowing smile and laughed his hearty laugh whenever the subject came up, and left people to draw their own conclusions. The old country wives, however, who are the best judges of these matters, as everyone knows, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means. They will hear nothing of pumpkins used as projectiles or elaborate practical jokes. No, to them the truth is clear. The Headless Horseman claimed Ichabod Crane, as he has claimed others and will claim still more. It became a favorite story, often told about the neighborhood round the winter evening fire. The bridge became more than ever an object of superstitious awe, and that may be the reason why the road has been altered in later years, so as to approach the church by the border of the mill pond rather than crossing that haunted bridge. The schoolhouse, being deserted, soon fell into decay. Its windows broke, its roof sagged, plant began to grow up through the floorboards, and it was reported, of course it was reported, to be haunted by the ghost of the unfortunate pedagogue. Even now, the tale tells us, a ploughboy loitering homeward on a still summer evening has often fancied he heard Ichabod's voice at a distance, chanting a melancholy psalm tune among the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow. So there the story rests, suspended between possible explanations, as all the best ghost stories are. Was Ichabod carried off by a supernatural force? Or was he simply the victim of an elaborate prank by a romantic rival? Did he die that night by the bridge? Or did he escape to live a long life as a lawyer and justice of the peace in some distant corner of the country? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between these possibilities. Perhaps it doesn't matter. Perhaps what matters is the story itself, the way it has been told and retold, growing and changing with each telling, becoming part of the fabric of Sleepy Hollow itself. And perhaps, dear listener, what matters most is that you have made this journey with us through that drowsy valley, that you have walked these moonlit roads, that you have felt the peculiar magic that hangs in the air of that enchanted place. Let your eyes remain closed now. Let your breathing continue its slow, steady rhythm. Feel how deeply relaxed you have become. Your body is heavy and comfortable. Your mind is quiet and peaceful. The story has washed over you like a gentle stream, carrying you toward the shores of sleep. Epilogue, a gentle conclusion. And so our tale comes to its end, though the mystery at its heart remains unsolved. In the great state of New York, in a little valley where time moves slowly and the modern world has never quite penetrated, the legend lives on. The brook still murmurs its ancient song. The trees still whisper their secrets to those who will listen. And on certain dark nights, when the moon rides behind clouds and the wind moans through the valley, some say you can still hear the thundering of hooves on the old road, still see a headless figure racing through the darkness in eternal pursuit of what was lost. But for you, dear listener, there's only peace now, only rest, only the gentle drift into dream. Feel how heavy your eyelids have become, how comfortable your bed is, how perfectly still and quiet everything is around you. The legend of Sleepy Hollow has been told countless times over the centuries since Washington Irving first put pen to paper. It has been read by candlelight and by electric lamp, by children who shiver deliciously at the scary parts, and by adults who recognize the humor and humanity beneath the supernatural trappings. It endures because it speaks to something deep in us, our fear of the dark, our love of mystery, our need for stories that take us out of our everyday lives and transport us to places where magic is possible and the impossible might just be true. But it also endures because, at its heart, it is a gentle story. Yes, there are scary moments. Yes, there is a chase through the darkness and a mysterious disappearance. But there is also humor and humanity, detailed descriptions of harvest feasts and autumn landscapes, the comedy of a lanky schoolmaster and his romantic misadventures. It is, in its way, a perfect bedtime story. It engages the imagination without overstimulating it. It provides just enough excitement to hold attention, while always maintaining an underlying current of peace and safety. For we know, even as we listen to tales of the Headless Horseman, that we are safe in our beds. We know that dawn will come, as it always does. We know that the story, however mysterious or frightening it might seem in the moment, will have an ending, and that ending will leave us not with terror, but with a pleasant drowsiness, a readiness to drift off into our own dreams. So let yourself drift now. Let the images from the story float through your mind without trying to hold on to them. The drowsy valley, the murmuring brook, the autumn leaves, the moonlight on the bridge, the mystery unsolved but somehow comfortable in its unsolvedness. Your body is completely relaxed. Every muscle has released its tension. Your breathing is slow and deep. You are safe. You are comfortable. You are ready for sleep. As the good people of Sleepy Hollow settle in for another peaceful night in their enchanted valley, as the stars wheel overhead and the brook sings its eternal lullaby, as the world grows quiet and still, you too can release yourself into the gentle embrace of sleep, knowing that tomorrow will bring new stories, new adventures. But for now, there's only this moment, this perfect moment of peace, this transition from waking to sleeping, this gentle letting go. Sleep well, dear listener, sleep peacefully, and may your dreams be as magical and as mysterious as the legend we have shared tonight. Good night.